we're going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so about Gen Z. As you can notice, none of us are Gen Z, shockingly. But we're going to just dive into some of the issues around it, how Gen Z differs from millennials. Is there really such a thing as Gen Z? So I think maybe if we start it there, is Gen Z a sort of a comfortable catch-all phrase for us as, you know, content makers and marketers, or is there really a Gen Z? Lucy?
Yeah, there is. I think it's quite easy to lump them in with millennials, but actually we found that like 12 to 19-year-olds, which is the recognized parameters of Gen Z, were exhibiting quite a sort of different outlook and aspirations. And I think that's really been driven by the fact that they've come of age during the economic crisis in a time of huge economic uncertainty with environmental change. And so their outlook is very different to the millennials. They've seen their millennial siblings get into loads of debt, struggle in the job market. And so what's emerged is this very progressive generation. They were born when it's normal to have a black president, normal for gay marriage to be legal. And so we found they were very, very progressive, very engaged, and very different to the stereotype of millennials. We always like to compare Hannah Horvath from Girls, if that's the millennial. Alex Dunphy from Modern Family is Generation Z.
Alick, any thoughts? Do they like to, how have you noticed in terms of their behavior? Do they spend? Do they save?
Yep. So we've set up a company called Osper, which is designed to teach young people to manage money responsibly. And we've now built, I think, one of the largest banking communities of 8 to 14-year-olds in Europe. And so we really get to see how they think about money on a day-to-day basis. And a great example of how Gen Z differs to previous generations is we have a 9-year-old in the service called Max. And after getting his Osper card, he actually set up a recurring subscription service with Xbox, and without realizing 4 weeks later, had no money left in his card. And if you go back 10 years, that experience of having your own banking product, setting it up online and losing all your money just wouldn't have been an experience a Gen Y or a Gen X would have gone through. So I think their exposure to the real world of money and the digital world is accelerating a lot further than previous generations.
I mean, Rahul, you sort of said an interesting point because you're seeing Gen Z as consumers, but also creators. What sort of insights do you have from that perspective?
I think it's fascinating. It's like we look at this generation as being one that's very practical, very real. At least the bias, in some ways, being from the States, is like this is the post 9/11, post crisis of 2008 generation that is thinking about the world in a very different way. There is no sense of entitlement. There's a sense that anything is possible. The technology, capabilities, everything that is available to do is there. It's on them to create. And that's very much changed the type of content you see, the type of content they consume, and just the general attitude. It's fascinating.
So I was listening to a really good podcast, a banter podcast, which a friend of mine, Jim Carroll, produces, and he talked to a bunch of Gen Zers. And one of the things that came from that was that they were like, Gen Z? We're not Gen Z. So that's a challenge. I mean, that's a challenge for people who are making content or who are marketing to them. How do you get past that challenge? And are there opportunities around marketing to Gen Z?
Well, that's the thing. They're perhaps the most engaged and sophisticated youth cohort to really come of age, which is really interesting because they're quite tough on brands. They have access to the internet and have had it since birth. So they're actively researching the behavior of brands and really differentiating between brands that they think behave well, have a set of values, and brands that don't. So that's a challenge and an opportunity. As a brand, you have to be spotless. But if you can empower that and connect with them in authentic ways by doing something as standalone value. So this group are really engaged in world issues, politics, news. If you can connect to that somehow in a really authentic way, I think you really stand a good chance of winning them over.
So my take is that previously there's been a shift understanding that Gen X and Gen Y have dampened their impact and the extent to which they listen to brands. To me, Gen Z is not about being marketed to. They're about having a conversation with. You have people out there like Zoella. Now, if you don't know who Zoella is and you're marketing to Gen Z, you've got a problem. She's a 18-year-old in Britain who has over 7 million followers on her YouTube channel. More girls will watch her than watch TV in the UK. And that's a conversation that she's having with girls between the ages of 10 to 14. So for us, I think going forward, what you need to be thinking about is, what does it feel like? And it's an interesting question. What does it feel like to have a conversation with an 11-year-old who's online? In our case, we have children come into our office on a regular basis, give us feedback about what we're doing, and then they write up blog posts and they share those with their friends. And we are genuinely interested in how they think about our service. So I think engagement and conversations rather than brand and market building is the way forward.
Yeah, I would completely agree with both of those points. It's very much, again, the good thing for marketers is it's coming back to the same principles, which is good content wins, authenticity wins, and this is a generation that really strongly believes in that, where, I mean, I think we're coming through this phase of influencer identification as well, being Vine stars and YouTube stars with product placements and things like that, where that I don't think will work with this generation.
Yeah, so like we saw in the last few days, the Australian blogger who's been talking quite openly. I mean, I think there's probably more to come on that story, probably a lot more to come on that story, but who has, been kickstarting again the conversation around being paid for products and the reality of social media. You're saying that those kind of strategies around the likes of kind of just product placements, you don't think that's going to wash?
I think it comes back to the point of authenticity. This generation is very much one that believes they know when they're being had or taken for a ride, and I think that's going to be one of the reasons that it doesn't work.
And do you see that in the types of content that performs from Storyful, that there's the sort of things that are that sort of debunk something that's happened, or are they popular with that kind of group of people?
Well, I mean, with us it's a little different because that's from the debunking is more beneficial to the news business, but you're seeing these stories, and when we're writing up case studies and about them, how fascinated you can see in regards to the demographics that are interested in it. Yeah, I think it absolutely is something that this generation believes greatly in, which is we're not going to be taken for a ride. We have everything at our disposal to understand what's happening. So it's very different.
What does the research, Lucie, say in terms of transparency and being truthful, and when it comes to Gen Z?
I think just in general that they're very engaged and quite tough on brands, and have a very sophisticated understanding of when they're being sold to or not. They're also quite activist about causes that they care for. So I make the comparison a lot with, whereas millennials care about sustainability and the planet, that it's often on quite a sort of, sorry millennials, superficial level. So they might make their face a rainbow on Facebook. But teenagers, Generation Z, are actually, they'll do something about it. So it's no surprise that ID's Gen Z issue was called the activist issue. And actually one of our case studies that we just did a study on Generation Z, which is amazing, guys. But one of the case studies, Sophie, was following the news about the Texas Senate debate on abortion rights, and they weren't allowing tampons into the room because they were worried that they could be used as weapons. And she thought that was so ridiculous that she coded a game called Tampon Run, where the tampons were the bullets that you shot people with. So that's just a really good example of how Generation Z are using technology not only to create, but invest and do something about causes that they care about.
And I guess to follow that on in the world of money and work, my parents' generation was in a generation where just earning a salary was important. My generation was all about earning a salary and having a hobby, but specifically a hobby which helped you stay healthy and fit. If you look at Gen Z today, so they've been surveyed, 76% of them expect their hobby to become their job. If you look at Gen X and Gen Y, 50% of them expect their hobby to become their job. So this generation is about turning the things that they are passionate about, even at the ages of 9, 10, 11, and that becoming their lifelong career and ambition and way of impacting the world.
So do you think then there's a myth then that they are more sensible and more conservative and more sort of thought through in terms of decisions because they've sort of grown up in a time of austerity and a recession. Is that a myth, or is there truth in it?
Well, I think it's actually, in fact, the opposite. So if you look at the stats in the UK, for example, this is the first generation that's going to grow up, in absolute terms, less wealthy than the previous generation. So for 7 generations from the 1920s, every generation consecutively has got richer and richer besides this generation. So in fact, I think they are incredibly thoughtful, and they are incredibly structured in the way in which they think about these problems, contrary to the previous generation who have just gone through the pop idol world, the X Factor world, where from their point of view, they get on a stage, they sing, and they become famous. And I think 9-year-olds today don't expect that anymore. They recognize that they want to go off and do those types of things. They start with a YouTube channel where they have 5 followers, and they build it to 20, and then it becomes 100, and it scales that way instead.
So it's less about quick wins and more about putting in the work and seeing how, and I suppose watching people who have put in the work and then they've turned it into a bigger brand. I'm interested in some of the other myths around Gen Z. I feel like we're talking a bit about like them, like they're aliens, like from a different planet,
Specimens.
But what are some of the myths, Lucie, from your research?
I mean, one of the things that we found really interesting was their relationship with food. The cliche about teenagers is the junk food, right? Junk food obsessives, but actually, this is a group that's been raised by foodie parents. So they've been raised on Jamie Oliver, knowing their prosciutto from their Parma ham and all of that. So actually, we found that they were very, very health conscious. It was very much a fit, not thin. They want to spend more on healthier foods. And also wanted to buy into food brands that had a sense of value. So things like Chipotle and Panera Bread in the US really came out as their favorite, the healthy, quality, fast casual restaurants. So very, very sophisticated on that front too. And again, in terms of the subjects that they care about, I think it's no accident that Snapchat has really ramped up its news coverage, that Vice Media has a huge news and a global news output. They're very, very interested in current events. So this idea of just being quite fatalistic and just like music blaring, I mean, they might do that too. But yeah, also following the news and see that as really important.
I mean, that's probably something you've noticed, and we've noticed at Mashable. We've got a presence on Snapchat on those places where we're definitely reaching a Gen Z audience and noticing that the big issues are as much of interest as softer things are. How have you seen that play out in terms of what people are consuming?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've had a fantastic partnership with Mashable, and you've got more and more brands like yours that are become big partners of ours in regards to engagement and just using content, telling stories that typically we're only told by the big traditional media companies, which you necessarily wouldn't have expected. And it's because the voracious appetite of this generation consuming that sort of content, wanting to know what's going on, wanting to know what's happening, which has been absolutely fascinating to see.
So what are the opportunities? How do people go about marketing to Gen Z? Because I think there is still a lot of head scratching about it. There's still, it sounds like a more difficult prospect, because it is a group of people who are who have grown up in a time of, greater or tougher economic times. How do you go about structuring your marketing towards them?
So the thing I think to recognize with Gen Z is they've got 2 things going for them which we've never seen before. One, they're being told by the world that they can do incredible things more than any previous generation as a young generation. 2, they've got the tools to reach millions of people at the age of 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. And so to me, the conversation with them has got to be about how can you help empower them to use those tools to reach a bigger audience. To make this really tangible for everyone in the room, with Osper, we've set up something called Opportunities. And Opportunities is basically the largest database of work experience and internship programs for literally 8 to 14-year-olds in the UK. And we provide those opportunities to children and parents on a regular basis to help them understand how they can expose their children to the world of work. And so this is no longer about marketing, and I guess it's a lot more about content, but at the heart of it, it's about helping children get further in life, and they really get excited by it.
Lucie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd also say treat them as individuals as well. There's a huge emphasis on individualism among all the teens that we surveyed, because the other thing to really remember is that they not only are the most ethnically diverse generation to date, so like really quite staggeringly so, we found in our data that they're actually less connected to traditional gender binaries. They're less concerned about sexuality. Loads of them, I think it was 80% of the teens we surveyed in the UK and the US said that they were experimenting with their sexuality or didn't want to be defined by a particular sexuality. And they're extending that to their behavior on social media. This is the Tumblr generation. They want to see themselves. They want to see real, unfettered imagery. And so they really don't want to be talked to your point about the Generation Z, we're not Generation Z. I think they don't want to be labeled in any particular way. You've got to really empower the individual to touch them.
And that's hard, right, Rahul? I mean, that's hard for us when you're trying to cater for a large group of people, but do it in an individual way, individualized way.
I think so, but I mean, this is coming back to the point about like influencers and I think you've got brand ambassadors will be redefined in a way. You are talking to a generation that are creating a lion's share of the content online. This generation should be looked at as content creators on behalf of brands in some ways as well, which I think is fascinating to watch because it's also been interesting to just watch the improvement in the overall quality of content that's coming from this generation, right? They are creating short films with iPhones because technology allows them to do that. So the ability to partner and work closely with these brands where they feel aligned, I think is something that's going to change very much. It's really interesting to watch.
The last thing I'm interested in is who are the heroes of Gen Z? Who are the figures and the people who they look up to?
It's funny, we actually found in our survey that Malala came out more popular than Beyonce, which I think says it all, really. But the interesting thread among all of their heroes, from Miley Cyrus, who isn't Generation Z, but she is very much a hero for them, has a charity for LGBT homeless youths. You have Lorde, who is tweeting all the time about body image and healthy body image. You've got Bella Thorne, who's not only an actress, but she's written a book about adult illiteracy and set up a charity for clean water for people. So I think it's looking at the kinds of heroes that all, again, very heavy social media presence. So it's no accident that Estee Lauder, for example, have got Miss Jenner as very Instagram-heavy celebrities that have a very intimate relationship with their audience. Cara Delevingne is another one. Again, tells her followers to embrace their weirdness, be an individual. So it's heroes with a social mission as well as being really popular and good at singing and writing novels.
Alick, any thoughts?
So beyond the good mission, which I completely agree with, I think accessibility is a really big part of becoming a hero to a young person. If they can see that person, touch that person, have a conversation with that person, I think that really changes the way they aspire to become that person. And a classic example was speaking to the National Citizen Service in the UK. They held a concert for young people. There were two really famous artists turn up, and they had Zoella turn up. Now, Zoella's running a YouTube channel. Artists are out touring. And they said the difference in the cheer that came from the teenagers when Zoella worked on stage versus two very famous trading artists was massive. And that was because Zoella was someone who would turned up on their laptop every day, day in, day out for the last year. So to me, accessibility is a really important driver for who young people aspire to become.
Yeah, I think the brands that we worked with that are targeting this audience are very much looking at campaigns that evolve around activism, around doing good, doing well, identification of people, young people that are very focused on these sort of social activities. So, and have done very well with those sort of campaigns. So it's really interesting.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you, Lucie, Alick, Rahul. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.